Take a helicopter trip up the Thames and you'll find that all the great landmarks of this vast capital city have stayed the same for decades. Tower Bridge is still there, so are the Houses of Parliament, and one of the bastions of the national game, cricket, is still played at the Oval. But some 16 miles upstream, there's another, newer city called Heathrow, which has epitomised change during the 20th century. Heathrow, Manchester, Birmingham, Liverpool, Swansea, Edinburgh, and scores of airfields around Britain have literally changed our lives, both for business and for pleasure. Today, we take flying great distances at great speeds and heights for granted. But it wasn't always like this. In the early part of the century, very few people even dared to get airborne.
The first commercial use of the aeroplane in England was in 1911, when Gustav Hamel operated for a week the first official airmail service. He carried 130,000 letters and postcards between Hendon and Windsor. By the end of the war, the aeroplane had begun to establish itself as a recognized vehicle, so much so that the Royal Air Force started to operate mail services between London, Paris and Cologne using converted military aeroplanes. In 1919, following the crossing of the Atlantic in easy stages by a United States flying boat, the first direct flight across was made by the late Captain John Alcock with Lieutenant Arthur Whitten Brown in a converted Vimy bomber. In the same year, the British airship, the R-34, with a crew of 30, made a double crossing of this ocean. The success of this voyage had the result of focusing attention for many years on the potentialities of the airship. On the 25th of August, Aircraft Transport and Travel Limited began a regular daily service between London and Paris. A week later, Handley Page Transport began to operate on the same route, and shortly afterwards opened a regular service between London and Brussels. And in the winter, Captain Ross Smith and his brother, Lieutenant Keith Smith, made the first flight between England and Australia, taking 30 days. In the spring of 1920, Croydon Airport was opened for the operation of cross-channel air services. Between 1920 and 1924, Handley Page Transport, Daimler Hire, Inston Airlines, and the British Marine Air Navigation Company maintained services at a loss in competition with heavily subsidized foreign airlines. By 1924, the position had become so serious that the government appointed a committee, later known as the Hambling Committee, to report on the methods of putting British air transport on a sound footing. This committee recommended that if British air transport were to survive, let alone develop, then one company and one alone must be entrusted with the task. This report led to the formation of Imperial Airways on March the 31st, 1924, as the chosen instrument of the government with the mandate to develop British air transport on an economic basis.
By 1924, Croydon, just south of London, had become London's major airport. It was a grass strip with a huge dip in the middle of the field. By today's standards, it was basic, very basic, but it did work. Before the day's flight, each aeroplane had to be carefully examined, overhauled, and certified airworthy by a qualified ground engineer. The weather played a much more dramatic role on these flimsy craft in those days, so the Met Man was all important. To get the wind speed, a small balloon was released. A theodolite was trained on it, and the information was then charted and collated before it was transferred to the huge London Continental Air Routes Weather Board, which gave anyone who wished to know the latest weather reports. Before too long, the passengers would arrive, usually from a hotel in Victoria about an hour's drive away. The pilots, meanwhile, briefed themselves on the latest weather over the channel. While the passengers cleared customs, the porters were already getting the baggage onto their simple trailers, ready to push them out to the waiting aircraft. The airliners of that era were based on World War I bombers, built by bygone firms like Handley Page and Vickers. With the engines already running, the passengers were pointed towards their giant of the sky. Most of them were fairly wealthy, as air transport was certainly not for the poor. When the passengers embarked, the mail was delivered in this very sensible way. Last, but by no means least, the co-pilot took his place in the aircraft. Both the pilot and his co-pilot were subjected to the elements in their open cockpit on their flight from Croydon to Paris. In 1924, aircraft used trailing radio aerials, so they couldn't broadcast on the ground. Just like the railways, a flagman had to give the pilot the all clear for takeoff from the control tower. The plywood and fabric cabins were surprisingly light, airy, and spacious. And there was always a feeling of excitement as the aircraft lumbered off the ground. Once airborne, both pilot and air traffic controller could talk to each other over the radio. And in bad weather or low cloud, the pilot could check his position through a wireless direction finding service, which worked like this.
Croydon, Croydon, Imperial RN calling, Imperial RN calling. Give me my position, please. Give me my position, please. Over.
Hello, Imperial RN. Croydon answering. For your position, switch on. Over.
The radio stations at Croydon and Pulham in Norfolk simultaneously took bearings from the aircraft. Croydon would process the signal using this goniometer to take an accurate bearing. The same thing was happening at Pulham, who then radioed their bearing back to Croydon. Plotting both bearings on a map gave the position of the aircraft at the crossing of the two bearings. In this case, the aircraft was 4 miles south of Ashford. For night flying, or during fog, the pilots would follow lighthouses, while the airports were floodlit and the cone light switched on. This was followed by a mist-penetrating beacon. If the pilot still couldn't find the airfield, a rocket was fired to guide him in. Although the system was crude by modern standards, it worked surprisingly well. Many a night flight landed quite safely at Croydon in the 1920s.
1926 was notable for bringing more large aircraft into operation. In March, 1 3-engined and 4 twin-engined Handley Page airliners were commissioned. In the same year, the first of the 3-engined Argosy class opened the Silver Wing service between London and Paris. These aeroplanes had accommodation for 20 passengers and a catering service was supplied. In December, the first regular Empire service was established with the opening of a fortnightly mail and passenger route between Cairo and Basra. The Hercules class was commissioned on this route. In 1927, plans were laid for further Empire services when Sir Alan Cobham made a 20,000-mile survey flight around Africa. 1928 began with the first Empire services from England when the route from London to Karachi was opened. In May, Lady Maud Hoare, the wife of the Secretary of State for Air, opened the rebuilt airport at Croydon. In 1931, the Hannibal Heracles class of airliner was put into service. These were the first 4-engined airliners in the world.
Based at Croydon, the HP42 was a new experience in comfort for both passengers and crew. The pilots were now in an enclosed cockpit or flight deck for the first time, and the aircraft was large enough to utilize a cabin crew in this quiet, smooth jumbo of its era. It cruised at about 100 miles an hour with a range of 500 miles, and it had an unblemished safety record for at least a decade. The long-distance version carried 12 passengers in the forward cabin and 12 in the rear, with 500 cubic feet of space in the middle for baggage and mail.
1935 saw the development of the routes to the continent and a great increase in the frequency of the Empire services. In the spring, Imperial Airways began a daily service between London, Brussels, Cologne, Prague, Vienna, and Budapest. All these developments made an increasing demand for personnel. And in June, Imperial Airways opened a school for the training of navigation officers and other ranks. United Airways was formed to operate services connecting London with Blackpool, the Isle of Man, Liverpool, and Leeds. At the end of the year, a new company came into the air transport field, when Hillman Airways, United Airways, and Spartan Airlines were amalgamated and became British Airways. It was in September of this year that the aeroplane demonstrated its striking ability to improve relationships when, during the European crisis, British Airways carried Mr. Neville Chamberlain on his 3 visits to Germany to confer with the German Chancellor. At the end of this year, the Secretary of State for Air announced that proposals would shortly be laid before the House of Commons for the formation of a public corporation to take over the interests of Imperial Airways and British Airways. In June, Imperial Airways head office was moved to the new building in Victoria.
BOAC announced a delay of at least 1 hour in departure due to unfavorable weather conditions. A further announcement will be made not later than 18 hours.
They can't find this weather. When can they? I'm going over to see about it.
Yes, sir.
Look here. What's all this about the weather not being fit for flying? Danny, look at it. The sun's shining.
As I'm sure you'll appreciate, it isn't a question of the weather here. It's a question of the weather along the route. There's some bad weather in the Bay of Biscay. That's delaying your service.
Yes, I can see that, but it's damned annoying all the same. Damned annoying.
Oh, excuse me.
Excuse me, madam.
Excuse me, madam, while I deal with this passenger, please. Yes, sir, I'm sure you'll appreciate that these delays put us out of gear as well.
Yes, I suppose they do. Well, thanks very much.
Not at all.
Excuse me, officer.
Yes,
But
ma'am.
that announcement just now, you know about...
Paris, about 70 minutes from London. Zurich, 3.5 hours. Warsaw, 6.5 hours. Egypt, about 30 hours.
Kenley, Biggin Hill, Hornchurch, North Weald, Debden. Will you warn your controller that this looks like yet another attack on airfields?
In 1939 saw the start of the Second World War. Radar was in its infancy, but it did give the RAF sufficient warning of the Luftwaffe raids over England. In fact, some of the enemy bombers had been used as airliners during the early 30s. But as the war progressed, so did aircraft development. The planes got bigger, faster, more efficient, and towards the end of the conflict, the first jets were unleashed on the world. By 1945, Germany was decimated. In August that year, Japan surrendered to the Allies. But a small airfield owned by the Ferry Aviation Company, called Great West Aerodrome, had already been earmarked by the Air Ministry in 1944 for a huge transport base near London at a place called Heathrow. Although building had already started, Heathrow was handed over to the Ministry of Civil Aviation on January the 1st, 1946. Lancasters had become Yorks.
They call it Heathrow locally. A few years back, it was 7 square miles of quiet Middlesex countryside. It was in April 1944 that history came to these country fields. An airport was required to finish off the Japanese, an airport for heavy, far-flying aircraft. An immediate need with an eye to the peaceful future. That was the beginning. And the landscape was changed and the past obliterated. Then from the huge cement mills, oceans of concrete like heavy lava poured forth to form the solid runways. Specimens of the concrete are tested to destruction point in machines which develop pressure of over 50 tons to the square inch. Now, as the runways stretch forth under the hands of the concreting gangs, the bulldozers, scrapers and grabs run out before them, preparing more ground and digging trenches for the complicated system of drains and cables that lie below the concrete. At the end of 1945, number 1 runway was complete.
On this first day of the new year, this proving flight starts off from Heathrow, which will be the future civil airport of London. And it takes off from the finest runway in the world.
On January the 1st, 1946, with 1 runway in service and 2 others near completion, Heathrow officially became London Airport.
The main runway at London Airport is more than 9,000 feet long, and eventually this air terminal will be able to receive 100 aircraft an hour and 4,000 passengers in the same time. 340,000 visitors each year come to the public enclosures to see the giant airliners of the world. The control tower houses aerodrome control and approach control, directing aircraft by radio telephone and other direction-finding devices, up to a distance of 40 miles away. No effort has been spared to ensure that there is all the equipment necessary for the control of the ever-increasing air traffic at London. Radar aerials locate the machines as far away as 25 miles. And a combination of radar and radio enables control staff to ascertain under inferior conditions the position of an aircraft and direct the pilot safely until the runway is in sight. It would be impossible to keep up with the pace of modern air traffic if equipment was not available to pass messages quickly and accurately to all parts of the world. Messages to other land stations go by telephone, wireless or teleprinter, as do weather reports, aircraft movements and other information. Teleprinters are in direct communication with aerodromes in this country and abroad. The pressing of a key connects with a receiving teleprinter, and the message is instantaneously transmitted. By a comprehensive system of internal communication, every department of this vast airport is linked. Up to control goes a message. From this station, pilots are given permission to take off and to land. They are told which runway to use.
Each time a pilot comes in from the other side of the world, he sees new changes. From this busy frontage of control towers, offices and hangars are drawn all the skeins of the web of the world's airways. This port has been founded. It has come to stay. Already it provides every scientific facility and every type of information necessary for the safe navigation of the air. But fog and mist, wind and rain, these are the chief hazards of the air. The Met Office is in touch with weather stations all over the world. But no matter how evil the weather, how thick the sky with fog or cloud or rain, there is still the airport's magic eye, which sees the pilot safely to land. Black and blind as it may be above, safely, surely, they lead him down to the runway. Thus, in under 2 years, British engineers had built and were operating one of the largest civil aerodromes in the world. But those were still pioneer days, and it was a time of flux and improvisation. Marquees, caravans, and RAF huts were the airline offices, custom sheds, and passenger lounges in those days. It was like a circus, but it was also history in the making. The local inhabitants, however, see things from a different angle. To the older ones, it must have seemed strange indeed to see giant aircraft roaring down paths that once they knew as pleasant loitering lanes. Stranger still to see the streams that they had known since childhood turned aside from their old winding courses to new straight concrete beds. And strange to see the familiar farms swept from the earth as though by a whirlwind. And surely the unkindest cut of all, a few of their pubs may have to go. But for many, it has meant changes of a different kind, and a lot have found work on the site, for the port is still building.
A marshaller with his bats brings into position an airliner which has just arrived. He alone is responsible. An error of judgment might damage these expensive machines. But long training makes it a simple task to the men who can park a plane as easily as a baby car. Also arrived a Viking of the King's Flight, from which His Highness the Duke of Edinburgh disembarked. A Stratocruiser from the USA moves past. The van at its side looks like a toy model. Languedoc from France. Sabina takes off for Belgium. Qantas Empire from Australia. Alitalia from Italy. And an airliner from India. Wings from every part of the world.
This now is London's airport. Out of the sky and into the sky, day and night the travellers come and go.
Bristol Brabazon, the largest civil airliner in the world, is due to land. And here she is, 130 tons of power, grace and beauty, winging down to runway 28. Later, we shall see in more detail this astounding trend in aviation. A few hundred yards away, one of Britain's latest, the Hermes, is being made ready for its flight to Johannesburg. It accommodates 40 passengers and is designed to fly 2,000 miles non-stop at a speed of 330 miles an hour. The crew's quarters, to the uninitiated, seem to be just a mass of instruments. But to the men who operate these luxurious machines, every dial, lever and indicator has its place in the business of flying. Baggage loading is carried out with clockwork precision. Each member of the staff contributes to the smooth running of the services. Checking over is the flight engineer, who, with a practiced eye, knows every feature of his machine. The crew comes aboard. Each officer trained and specialized in his job, for radio, for navigation, and for piloting, with many thousands of flying hours to his credit. Captain Bennett looks on. To him, one day London, the next South Africa, is just a job to be done efficiently. And so the passengers come forward, customs and all formalities having been completed. The propellers turn, and we bid them bon voyage. Today is Tuesday. Tomorrow, Wednesday, they will touch down at Johannesburg Airport. Behind the scenes at the maintenance hangars, highly skilled mechanics maintain the fullest investigations after every flight. The stringent requirements of the International Certificates of Airworthiness demand that machines are to the engineers for regular checks and servicing. An Avro York is towed away. A Hermes, sister ship to that which left earlier for South Africa, moves by, making the mechanic under the tail look very small. Yes, there are many interesting things to be seen over there where the backroom boys are found. To Rome from London takes 6.5 hours. The stewardess attends to last-minute requirements, smoothly and efficiently. Smooth and efficient after careful study at the College for Stewards. It's here, under the tutorship of Mr. John Lawrence, that correct procedure is learnt. All the effects are to hand, including a dummy aircraft, correctly equipped to the last detail. This recruit shows how he would welcome a passenger aboard. But Instructor Lawrence has other ideas. No need to scrape and bow, but politely and with a smile. After some practice, it will come naturally. Inside the mock-up aeroplane, a student stewardess answers a call. Mrs. Thomas Traveller is the talkative type. How on earth do I get away from her? In goes teacher to show how. That's a fine view, madam. You can see the entire mountain range. Do excuse me a moment. It's easy if you have the know-how. Now it's time to awaken them. Easy does it. That's not a nice way to behave. The correct way is with a nice cup of tea. Take note, and you'll do it correctly next time. From the well-equipped galley comes luncheon for one. All she has to do is place it upon the table. Wham! The customer is always right. Come, come now, this is how. And with the agility born of years of experience, Mr. Lawrence again shows the way. Contact. The mighty air screws of the giant Stratocruiser roar into life. It's a wonderful sight out there on the tarmac. The crew's cabin looks like a small town power station, completely dwarfing the mechanic in the right-hand corner of our picture. The last word in comfort on the North Atlantic run to Montreal and New York. Still aboard this gigantic Stratocruiser, the steward comes up from the lower lounge to show how the berths are made up for the night.
Just as in the 20s, airliners were derivations of First World War bombers, in the 40s, history was to repeat itself. The B-29 Superfortress ended the war with Japan in 1945 by dropping the first atom bomb on Hiroshima. But after the war, its transport counterpart, the C-97, evolved into the Stratocruiser. In late 1945, all the major aircraft manufacturers were looking to civil aviation to fill their order books, and Boeing was no exception. With its expertise in large pressurized aircraft, Boeing built 55 Stratocruisers, which flew for a decade with all the major US airlines and BOAC. It was the ultimate in luxury international travel, in an era before the introduction of economy and tourist fares. The spiral staircase down to the lower deck lounge meant that passengers could stretch their legs during the long flights over the oceans and have a drink in a different environment instead of being stuck in a seat for the whole trip. There was also the ladies' lounge for keeping up in-flight appearances, while the aircraft flew along at 300 miles an hour with a range of 4,000 miles. The Stratocruiser's main competitors were from Lockheed and Douglas, like this Constellation, which were really pre-war designs. While Heathrow was still under construction, RAF Northolt, just 4 miles away to the north, was loaned to the Ministry of Civil Aviation in 1946.
Situated at Northolt is London's other main airways terminal. Serving the shorter continental routes, the constant movement of incoming and outgoing traffic makes it a hive of ceaseless activity. Scandinavian Airways touch down here. Aer Lingus goes out for Dublin. Where to now? Lisbon, Oslo or Istanbul? A plane is on the tarmac ready to leave for Paris. Members of the crew go into the briefing room, where they learn from the briefing officer of weather conditions, changes in landing facilities abroad, of new runway markings. They get an exact and precise picture at a glance. It's 10:55 and time to embark. In aerodrome control, the officer gives the pilot the okay to approach runway. A few minutes to go and the air is clear. In 90 minutes, we shall be in the capital city of France.
Northolt reverted to the RAF in 1954, but back in 1947, Heathrow was pushing more and more passengers through its systems.
All this requires careful, intricate and precise organization, difficult enough under the best conditions. Yet here a major air junction is being operated while the buildings and runways are still growing up around it. This building will continue for perhaps 6 years yet, for its plans are vast. But in the end, no matter what the future of aircraft may be, Stratocruiser, Brabazon or Flying Wing, here will be an airfield second to none.
Long-distance bulk travel was thought to be the future of air transport in the late 40s. The Bristol Brabazon had been designed to fly from London to New York non-stop. This was a huge enterprise for a British company based at Filton, near Bristol.
This is how the Brabazon would appear if placed on her tail in Trafalgar Square, London. Wingtip to wingtip, she measures 230 feet. To house her and all the assembly services necessary to her, a complete new factory unit was constructed, to which the aircraft would be moved during the latter stages of her building. This assembly hall represents a really remarkable achievement in constructional engineering. Designed by Mr. Eric Ross of Bristol, it fulfills the function of being the largest hangar in the world. The pilot tests out his controls. The Brabazon's controls, on which so much depends, are hydraulically operated. At an early stage, they were laid out in a special shop and linked to this mock-up cockpit for trial and retrial, first as individual units, then as a combined system. And now, with her skin nearly complete, she's beginning to look like an aeroplane. Soon she'll outgrow this hangar and move to the new assembly hall to receive her wings and tail. Will she clear the wall? Have the calculations been correct? The nose clears the east wall of the hangar by 1 foot 3 inches, just as it was planned. Tail first, wingless and powerless, she enters her new home. When she leaves it, she'll be a completed aeroplane ready for her first takeoff. These are the components of one of the 8 engines of the Brabazon Mark I. They are Bristol Centaurus, 18-cylinder, 2,500 horsepower. Mark II will be powered by Bristol Proteus propeller turbines. In the aircraft, the engines are arranged in pairs, each engine driving one of 2 coaxially mounted propellers. An overhead crane lifts each unit into position through the bottom access door of the engine bay. Afterwards follow oil and fuel connections, throttle controls, and 288 sparking plugs in all. Meanwhile, inside the fuselage, they are fitting all the delicate equipment that will test the airworthiness and the flight behavior of the aircraft in the skies. The foreman tests the telephone intercom system, then once more takes his long walk forward past the recording gear, the cine cameras, and the research instruments that will all play their parts under test conditions in the largest flying laboratory in the world. The chief test pilot, his co-pilot and a crew of 8 men go aboard. time, the Brabazon moves forward under her own engines. At last, the time approaches when no more can be done on the ground.
Hello, Control. Hello, Control. I'm going to make a fairly fast run now. It may be a takeoff, it may not. I don't know.
With a passenger carrying capacity of 100 and a crew of 12, this breathtaking airliner provides for a forward lounge, dining saloon, lounge bar and cinema, whilst cruising at 250 miles an hour. Lord Brabazon, holder of Britain's pilot licence number 1, and whose name this aircraft bears, goes aboard.
Lord Brabazon was to be disappointed, as metal fatigue problems in the propeller mountings meant that only one Brabazon was ever built. The other great British hope was the first commercial jet airliner in the world.
The Comet takes the air. This superb streamlined aircraft is the latest thing in travel. Powered by 4 pure jet engines, it recently flew 1,800 miles in 4 hours, averaging 450 miles an hour, or, if you prefer it, 7.5 miles a minute. The last word in rapid transportation, the Comet brings New York within 6 to 8 hours of London, and Australia within a day and a half.
The Comet was given its certificate of airworthiness in 1952. On May the 2nd, the first jet airliner service in the world started between Heathrow and Johannesburg. With optimism and pride, BOAC had taken delivery of the Comet 1 6 months ahead of schedule. Britain led the way in civil jet transport. But exactly 1 year after that inaugural flight, disaster. The Comet 1 had come down in a violent thunderstorm. The accident was investigated and concluded that the tragedy was an act of God. With business as usual, de Havilland introduced the new Comet 2 in August 1953. But on January the 10th, 1954, a second Comet 1 crashed in flames off the coast of Elba shortly after taking off from Rome's Ciampino airport. There were no survivors. All Comets were grounded by BOAC. Many of the pieces were salvaged and flown back to the Royal Aircraft Establishment at Farnborough to find the cause of this second disaster. On March the 23rd, BOAC resumed its Comet services while Farnborough continued to rebuild the Elba wreckage. Unbelievably, just 2 weeks later, 35 miles north of Stromboli Island, yet another Comet 1 crashed, this time at night. There were no witnesses and no clues. The government withdrew the Comet certificate of airworthiness on the very next day. Farnborough built a huge water testing tank to simulate 11 hours of pressurized flight every 21 minutes. they also flew a Comet, the equivalent of twice around the world, while they continued to rebuild the Elbe wreckage to find an answer to these three inexplicable tragedies. Suddenly, the water tank gave the answer. The Comet submerged in it developed a crack by a portside window, and the cabin ripped open some 15 feet. Further examination of the Elbe Comet confirmed that the failure had indeed started at the rear direction finding aerial, or ADF, window in the roof of the cabin. The internal pressure forced the two halves of the cabin roof upwards, breaking away violently along the wings. Then a portion of the fuselage was blown backwards by the airstream and struck the tail. After that, the aircraft rapidly broke up. Metal fatigue was also found to be a cause. Britain had lost its lead in jetliners because on the 15th of July 1954, just 4 days before the Comet 3 prototype took to the air, the rival Boeing company launched what was to become the most popular jet airliner to date, the 707. The post-war boom in passenger traffic hadn't materialized as the experts had predicted. But by the mid-50s, more of us were flying. The Queen opened the new central area at Heathrow in 1955. And Britain produced the first turboprop airliner, the Vickers Viscount. Heathrow had become the busiest international airport in the world. At its midsummer height, 38 different airlines made more than 600 landings and takeoffs every 24 hours. The Comet had overcome its earlier problems, and in the year up to the 28th of December 1966, Heathrow handled 3 million passengers. Airfares were coming down, and aircraft were becoming more efficient. By 1957, it was obvious that air travel was expanding at an alarming rate, so proposals were put forward to expand Heathrow even further. The smooth, reliable Viscount medium-range airliner was to become a world beater, as Vickers sold over 440 of them. By now, Heathrow was handling more and more air traffic at night.
Right round the clock, 7 days a week, the men in the control tower guide in the aircraft. In the darkened approach control room, the controllers, by skillful use of height and distance, keep the planes separated from each other as they leave the established air lanes and come in to land at their common destination.
Speedbird 935, closing with the localizer, 8 miles to go. Position yourself and advise established.
935, we'll go. Field and set, we cleared the tower.
935, roger, 6 miles to go. Call the tower on 1181.
935.
At night, and in bad visibility, pilots are guided by radio towards the runway until they can pick the lights by which they judge their exact position for landing. The Calvert system of approach lighting was developed in Britain, and London Airport's installation was the first of its kind. Since then, the system has been adopted internationally. And mainly at night, when the volume of passenger traffic begins to recede, the freight planes take over, keeping the handlers in the sheds and on the aprons at full stretch. During the brief interval between 3 a.m. and dawn, even here in the top of the tower, where all the movements of aircraft from touchdown to takeoff are meticulously controlled, a man can relax. Until the KLM freighter calls up with a request for his clearance for takeoff to Luxembourg.
Burnham above 2, Watford and Brookman's Park at 3,000 feet. Climb under radar control, maintain 15,000 feet.
An Air India Super G Constellation arrives from Bombay. In spite of the attention lavished on their comfort since they set out yesterday, the passengers are rather tired after so long a journey. Particularly for those changing planes, the prospect of waiting is as grey as the English sky they'd been told to expect. But at the North Terminal, where the long-distance passengers disembark, Ram Rustamji, the new First Secretary at the Oslo Embassy, is met by a sunny summer morning and a receptionist who will take care of his family. An interline car runs those in transit across to the central terminal building. Before 1939, an ordinary day's work was enough to service the limited volume of air traffic. Today, the British Overseas Airways Corporation and British European Airways engineering bases work 3 shifts, right round the clock, 7 days a week. The Rustamjis enjoy the peaceful luxury of the passenger restaurant, and outside the traffic continues to Geneva, Glasgow, Milan, Brussels, Stockholm, Lisbon, Frankfurt, while a British European Airways captain and first officer arrive to take charge of their flight, BE 420 to Amsterdam. From the Aeronautical Information Service, they gather all the particulars about radio aids and hazards en route or at the airport of arrival. From the coach, from the London terminal, the passengers follow their numbered channel onto escalator and into waiting bay. While porters put their luggage on the conveyor belts to customs, the passengers mingle with those of other flights.
On October the 26th, 1958, the Boeing 707 began flights across the Atlantic just 22 days after the Comet 4 began its transatlantic service. By the early 1960s, 2 great debates on the future of air travel culminated in 2 opposing conclusions. One was the ability to fly a few passengers at twice the speed of sound in a masterpiece of technology named Concorde. This concept was far beyond the resources of just one nation. So, in 1962, a formal agreement was signed between Britain and France to embark on the project. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, the Boeing company had decided to go the other way by building the largest commercial aircraft in history, the giant 747. It was to be 6 stories high, 231 feet long, with a wingspan wider than a football field. In Europe, Concorde was being built at Filton in England and Toulouse in France. To link the two factories, a guppy was used to transport parts and sections. The British Aircraft Corporation made Concorde's nose, the tail, and parts of the fuselage. Aerospatiale of France built the rest. Concorde had to have 4 new engines, developing enough thrust to drive 8,000 family cars. It was the Olympus, developed and built by Rolls-Royce and Snecma of France. Boeing also needed a new engine to power the 747, and they got it from Pratt & Whitney. It was called a high bypass ratio engine, which was a development of the fan jet. It produced a massive 43,500 pounds of thrust. Pratt & Whitney had to test the engine on a leased B-52 from the Air Force. On Monday, September the 30th, 1968, Bill Allen of Boeing saw his vision realized.
We have an airplane now, a remarkable one. Let us move forward to see it in service on the airlines.
Apparently, some of the crowd who were there that day didn't think the aircraft was that big until it came closer. Just a few months later, Concorde 001 was rolled out at Toulouse and made its first flight on the 2nd of March, 1969. Concorde 002 did its test flying from Filton, near Bristol.
002, clear takeoff. 230, 7 knots.
Every new type of airliner has to go through stringent tests, and the 747 was no exception, as Malcolm Stamper explains.
We have all sorts of difficult tests. We'll take the 747 and purposely drag its tail on the runway to make sure that it will take off in that mode if the pilot over-rotated the airplane.
The VMU tests determine the maximum performance of the aircraft in the takeoff configuration. They're performed by placing the tail section of the aircraft in contact with the runway until the airplane lifts off. The speed which it lifts off is called the minimum unstick speed, or VMU.
We actually do a rejected takeoff test where we lock the brakes and freeze out the anti-skid devices. What happens is the brakes are locked, so the tires actually burn off, and it actually burns the wheels off, and it sits finally, and it catches fire. And you have to sit in the plane for 5 minutes without touching it. The fire trucks are there to see if passengers are there that have time to get off, and then you're allowed to put out the fire. We paid the pilots a little extra for this.
The 747 flew its inaugural flight from New York to Heathrow on the 22nd of January, 1970. Sales were to reach over 1,000. Concorde went through 4,000 hours of test flying at twice the height of Everest, and it finally went into service on the 21st of January 1976, but never recovered its massive production costs. The Gatwick-Heathrow Airlink was inaugurated in June 1978. Gatwick became London's second airport in 1953, and with the advent of cheap fares, it was handling 10 million passengers by 1980. Meanwhile, Heathrow was still expanding, with Terminal 4 opening on the 12th of April 1986. 7.5 million passengers went through it in its first year. All those passengers had to be fed. Breakfasts, lunches, teas and dinners. The British Airways kitchens alone made over 30,000 meals every single day. Taxiways had almost become motorways, and even the underground was extended to Terminal 4. By 1992, Heathrow was handling a staggering 44 million passengers, Gatwick nearly 20 million, Manchester 11 million, and Edinburgh 2.5 million. International air travel even caters for stretcher cases. Passengers board their flights to all the corners of the globe, and in Britain alone, there are 5% more of us on average every year. Over 80 million pieces of baggage go through the system, while shops and duty-free bring in over £150 million a year. The car parks alone at Britain's major airports bring in a staggering £48 million. Heathrow has an aircraft landing or taking off every 90 seconds, with 1,200 movements every 24 hours. Over 53,000 people earn their living in London's second city. Air travel has indeed changed all our lives since those bygone days of the 1920s. And Britain is very much looking to the future as part of the incredible success story of the Airbus. With its modern technology, Britain, France, Germany and Spain are showing the way by capturing some 30% of the world's total aircraft sales. The A340 is the first European long-haul four-engined airliner developed in the last quarter of a century. Airports will continue to expand as aircraft get bigger, faster, fly higher, further, and airfares may come down. But whatever happens, air travel will certainly continue to change all our lives.